delight and pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Nita Farahany from Vanderbilt Law School, and from much more than that, in a moment. I asked Nita walking over how to describe her work best, and I'm going to try to spell it out, so you got it, that Professor Farahany uses neuroscience and behavioral genetics as a lens to understand human moral behavior, responsibility in particular, and other questions as well. That just begins to sort of scratch the surface for what Professor Farahany is doing in her extraordinarily innovative scholarship. We're fond of saying in bioethics that we're an interdisciplinary field, and that's true. And then we also have within our interdisciplinary field interdisciplinary phenomena, right? Say single people who are well-trained, incredibly well-trained in one body in multiple disciplines. And Nita probably represents this as well as anybody I know of. Nita has undergraduate and master's degree training in the sciences, and a PhD in philosophy, and a JD in law. This is the sort of thing that it could be terribly intimidating in anyone who is not as gracious and as committed to making her work available to people who don't have the benefit of her extraordinary triple training. And so that's something that I think I particularly admire about Nita's work. Nita is currently a professor at Vanderbilt Law School with appointments elsewhere in the university. Of particular note, and I will stop there with this last comment, in 2010, President Obama appointed Professor Farahany to the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. This, as everyone knows here, is President Obama's National Bioethics Commission. It's a real honor, obviously, to be appointed to the commission, and it's also very fortunate for all of us that Professor Farahany was so selected. She's going to be speaking to us about incriminating thoughts, very intriguing topic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Farahany, Professor Farahany, to our place.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and also for being here today and for having me here today. Today I'm going to talk with you about a topic which is kind of dear to my heart, something that I've been working on for a while, which is looking at the intersection of neuroscience and criminal law, but in particular thinking about it from a different perspective than a number of people have been looking at it, including myself, which is to think about what the implications of emerging cognitive neuroscience are for criminal responsibility. I wanted to think about it from a different perspective, which is what more can neuroscience tell us about our behavior, about ourselves, about our memories, about our thoughts, and if it can tell us additional things about our memories, our thoughts, our ideas, and we can access that information, what will be the implications from a legal perspective of using that information against an individual. And in particular, I'm using this as an extended thought experiment, using neuroscience as both a tool and a test to try to understand what the privilege against self-incrimination means under the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. Because when we think about using our thoughts or our words against ourselves, one thing that should pop into our mind is, no, I take the Fifth, right? I plead the Fifth Amendment. I have a right not to self-incriminate myself. And so as I started to read more about emerging neuroscience, my ability to detect thoughts, memories, ideas, visual imagery, emotions in the brain, my thought was, well, could we use this information, or would it violate our privilege against self-incrimination? And to answer that question, I needed to know, what does the privilege against self-incrimination protect, and why does it protect what it does protect? Right? Is there something about the rationale of what we protect under the self-incrimination clause in the Fifth Amendment that would help us predict how we might deal with these types of emerging neuroscience? So this talk is based on a paper that was recently published in the Stanford Law Review with the same title, Incriminating Thoughts. And the article in the presentation serves three goals. One is to propose a new model for how to think about self-incrimination. Second is to realign existing descriptive rationales for why we extend the privilege against self-incrimination to the new model that I propose here. And third is to use that new model to solve existing and future riddles about self-incrimination. In particular, what I discovered with the descriptive explanation of what self-incrimination currently protects is that it has significant normative shortcomings when we think about how it would apply to neuroscience. And using neuroscience as a tool and a lens to expose those normative shortcomings can be quite helpful. We can see how the current doctrine falls short. It doesn't protect the things that the ordinary person would want to protect, and that we would expect the self-incrimination clause of the Fifth Amendment to protect. So, let's see, wrong place. There we go. So, as with most of my work, my lens into this question is, how is the law going to deal with emerging technologies from genetic and neuroscience? So, the first one, I started grappling with the basic question of, how is the court going to deal with Fourth and Fifth Amendment claims by defendants when governments collect DNA that have been shed on the water bottles that you're all drinking right now, through hair clippings, through blood left at a crime scene. And I'm going to be talking about this a little bit later today with the fellows about this separate piece that I ended up focusing on. Once I started with this question about how are we going to deal with genetics and looking at it from the lens of abandoned DNA, which is the way that courts currently think about it, which is you leave traces of yourself behind, and when you leave those traces of yourself behind, you abandon them. I wondered, how might courts deal with claims by defendants against the government when they use futuristic investigative techniques? So, for example, if you could detect whether a person was lying, or what a person was thinking, or what memories a person had stored in their brain, and if those things emanate from your brain as electrical activity, was the court going to deal with them just like shed DNA, which is you've abandoned it and left it behind? Or is there going to be some other way in which we have insights into thinking about that information, the things stored in your brain, the things that emanate from your brain, being able to detect those types of information? Are we going to think about these things together? Are we going to think about them separately? What does it tell us about our existing normative commitments for procedural protections of individuals who enter into the criminal justice system? And I keep pushing the button over here, which is not connected. All right, so to answer the second question about thoughts in the brain, I wondered, does the self-incrimination clause of the Fifth Amendment protect our thoughts as well as our spoken words? And I quickly learned that the answer to this question was not at all clear, and that it may depend upon an incoherent approach that an existing doctrine that focuses on the form the evidence takes, whether it's physical or testimonial. And I learned that the fundamental disagreements about what the self-incrimination clause protects persist through courts, through the academy, through individuals who are trying to understand what self-incrimination actually means. So to address how investigative techniques based on emerging neuroscience would fare, I realized that I was going to need to have a theory about when does the privilege against self-incrimination apply, which requires understanding a couple of things. First is, what does it mean to compel a person? Because the clause that we're focusing on here is that nor shall any person be compelled in a criminal case to be a witness against himself. So we need to understand, what does it mean to compel someone? And second, we need to understand, what does it mean to be a witness against oneself? And it turns out this is the primary question that this paper focuses on. So the issue of compelling doesn't really matter unless the person is being compelled to be a witness against himself. And this idea of what does it mean to be a witness against oneself turns out to be a pretty narrow and pretty interesting little enigma in law. So compulsion is the easier of the two to define. Compulsion means to extract from a person evidence by using force and obliging them to respond. And the instrumentality that is used to do so, that ends up being the most important issue. But defining compulsion isn't particularly helpful, as the privilege against self-incrimination only applies when a person is forced to be a witness against himself, not merely furnish evidence against themselves. So when you leave your DNA behind on your water bottles here, and I'm able to extract the same from your water bottles, there's no compulsion involved. And there's no witnessing involved, because all I've done is taken your body and used it to furnish evidence against yourself. I haven't used your spoken words. I haven't forced you to be a witness against yourself. To be a witness, as currently applied, turns largely on the court's bodily evidence cases. So there have been a number of cases in which the court has had to answer the question of, does the Fifth Amendment apply when the court takes evidence from your body and forces you to supply information from your body to be used against you in court? So in a famous case in Holt v. United States, the court said that the Fifth Amendment is a prohibition on the use of physical or moral compulsion to extort communications from a person and not the exclusion of somebody's body as evidence when it's material. In Holt, the defendant was shot as he was leaving a convenience store that he had robbed. A bullet was embedded in his shoulder, and the police wanted to extract the bullet in order to use it in the criminal case to establish the match between the bullet in his shoulder and the bullet that was fired from the crime scene. And he tried to assert his right against self-incrimination to say, no, that bullet would be forcing me to be a witness against myself. And the court said, nope, it doesn't work that way. The bullet is only taking evidence from your body. It's not a moral compulsion of communication against yourself. Now, it turns out in Holt that the Fourth Amendment protected him from having the bullet extracted because the search or seizure of the information was too intrusive because they would have to do surgery given where it was located that would have been particularly dangerous to his body. But not so in a later case, in Schmerber v. California in 1966, where the court codified the existing approach, which dichotomizes physical and testimonial evidence. In that case, while intoxicated, Schmerber was taken into the hospital, and he was forcibly subjected to a blood draw, where the police were seeking to establish that he was intoxicated through his blood alcohol content. Of course, the blood test came back, demonstrated he was actually intoxicated, and he later claims that it violated both his Fourth Amendment privilege against search and seizure and his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination to use the blood test against him. In that case, the court said that the blood tests were neither testimony relating to some communicative act or writing by the petitioner, nor did it violate his right against search and seizure because it was minimally intrusive. Everybody goes in, gets blood test, it's a minor process, it was done in the hospital, it was done in the same way that blood draws are normally done. So it was minimally intrusive, and it didn't violate his right against self-incrimination because there was no communication or written testimony that was required of him. His blood could be used against him, and it was simply him being compelled to furnish evidence against himself, not being compelled to self-incriminate himself. And yet in Schmerber, the court recognized, although it has not since acted upon it, that physical evidence can sometimes be quasi-testimonial. Okay, quasi-testimonial. And that such cases would present difficulties. So to date, the court has defined physical as things like appearances, including appearance evidence where there's no bodily surface that is penetrated and no biological material removed. So for example, if you're forced to create a footprint or a voice print, right? So if you're forced to speak words that they know that the criminal suspect spoke, or to be forced to stand in a lineup where you could be identified amongst a number of other individuals. They define physical as intrusion into the body. So using, for example, penetrating the surface through x-rays. I'm sure many of you have gone into an airport recently where you've been forced to stand up like this, where they've done a little x-ray. And it used to be that they would have much more detailed images. Now it's just a little okay or not because of the uproar that existed. But those things, penetrating beneath the surface, looking at an x-ray through you, all of those things have been said to be physical evidence. So you're not being forced to self-incriminate yourself. Scrapings from the skin in order to match skin, fibers under fingernails that have been removed, all of these have been held to be physical evidence, which doesn't violate your right against self-incrimination. Even viewing private parts of the body, including strip searches or body cavity searches, don't violate your right against self-incrimination because it's simply using the body as evidence against the individual rather than forcing them to speak words or to furnish testimony against themselves. By contrast, the court has said in dicta in cases, which means there's no precedential value, but they recognize that there's a murky area. But there are some things that may be quasi-testimonial. There's a problem with this physical versus testimonial dichotomy. What they've said in these cases is that things like the slurring of speech or the mannerisms of an individual. So if you go through a psychological testimony or psychiatric evaluation, and during your psychiatric evaluation you have little facial tics, right? If somebody's trying to infer from your facial tics what you are thinking or feeling, or trying to understand from your mannerisms whether or not you're lying, or using something like a traditional lie detector test, where it's really just measuring physiological differences, but you're trying to draw inferences about a person's yes-no responses and the veracity or truthfulness of those responses, that those may be quasi-testimonial, and as quasi-testimonial evidence, they might in fact implicate your right against self-incrimination. But the court has never ruled on such a case. They've simply said in dicta, this could be problematic with the existing dichotomy that we have. The court has said that testimonial evidence, which is off limits if it has been compelled, are things like communications. These are spoken words or thoughts, written words or thoughts, or the production of papers. So when you've been forced to produce papers that are in your hold, so you created business papers, you've created other types of papers, which weren't created in compulsion, right, in response to a government inquiry, but you nevertheless have them in your possession. If you're forced to produce them, that act of production might be protected, even if the papers themselves may not. Okay, so this is existing doctrine. This is how the court thinks about it, which is physical, quasi-physical, and testimonial. And I propose that this doesn't work, and that neuroscience shows us that this is simply not a model that makes any sense for existing doctrine, nor will it make sense as future investigative techniques are developed. So one would think that the question of whether evidence is privileged or not could be answered easily by simply understanding what is the purpose of the self-incrimination clause, right? Why do we actually protect individuals from being forced to speak against themselves? And if we can understand that, then we can understand what should be protected and what shouldn't be protected. But scholars continue to advance myriad theories on its underlying rationale, including, for example, that it's designed to protect mental privacy, right? The idea that there's some zone of personal space that you should actually be protected from, and that the Fifth Amendment is really a liberty kind of interest, where you have this zone that is protected by it. Or they argue that it's about burden of proof, that the government shouldn't be allowed to rely on a defendant to provide substantive information. The government needs to go out and investigate on its own. They can't rely on the person to furnish evidence. That would lead to, for example, too much abuse. And this was the historic rationale, which is that it was really designed to guard against torture. If we look at the historical basis of the Fifth Amendment, we see that there was the Star Chamber, where individuals were forced to testify with regard to their religious beliefs, and it was designed to protect against that kind of religious persecution. So maybe that's really what it's about, which is we're trying to prevent government abuse. Of course, that wouldn't help us very much as we think about future investigative techniques that require minimal physical intrusion upon an individual. Other people say, no, really it's about reliability. If we compel testimony, if we force a person to speak, it's unlikely to be particularly reliable. Right? You see this as part of the debate with respect to interrogations, particularly with respect to Guantanamo Bay, as there was a significant amount of debate happening about torturous types of investigative techniques. The question was, well, even if people claim that there is any value to this, is it true that there'd be any value, or is it more likely that this evidence would be utterly unreliable? Because the likelihood of a person giving truthful responses under such types of pressure is quite low. Probably one of the most popular ones is the cruel trilemma theory, which says that a person should not be forced into the untenable position of having to decide between self-accusation, perjury, or contempt. That if you're forcing a person to testify, that's their choices. They either can accuse themselves, they can lie, or if we don't give them a privilege against self-incrimination, we're going to hold them in contempt. That's a cruel trilemma. And so we should guard people against that. Well, about 20 years ago, Bill Stuntz introduced a descriptive model that likens self-incrimination to a criminal excuse. So we grant excuses in criminal law because we understand that humans are fallible. We recognize that to hold an individual to a higher standard than we would expect the average person to be able to avail themselves of, that would be unjust, unfair, that it would undermine the legitimacy of the criminal justice system to hold people to a higher level of responsibility than we would expect of ourselves. And so Bill Stunt said, you know what, if we think about that idea, which is that's really what the role of excuse is, we don't say that a person is not guilty. We say, we think what you did was wrong, but we understand. And we're going to give you a limited excuse which will decrease the extent to which we'll hold you responsible. And we put that together with the cruel trilemma. We can understand what the model is really about. We can understand what self-incrimination is really about. And he says the idea is that, that what we really do is we excuse individuals for being in this position. Okay, so the idea is we excuse them for being in a position of self-accusation of perjury. We recognize that the temptation to lie would be so strong in those cases that we give them a limited excuse. That limited excuse is the privilege against self-incrimination. It says we recognize the fallibility of individuals, and as such, we give them a privilege that guards them against this type of abuse. And so it balances the hard choices that an individual faces against societal interest in both fair prosecution and law-abiding behavior, which means if societal interests are strong enough, we don't grant the excuse. And that's true in criminal law for excuse as well, which is if societal interest is strong enough, we say, even though we might think that a person is fallible, we nevertheless won't grant you an excuse. Well, it turns out that through Stunt's model, and since he proposed this model, this is the best descriptive model of the Fifth Amendment. This is the best explanation for when we grant individuals a right against self-incrimination and when we don't. These other models, while they may have normative appeal, don't actually align with current doctrine. Okay, if we look at current doctrine, we say they don't make any sense. It's not a way that we can actually describe current doctrine. So this last model gives us a good descriptive understanding. But the problem is it doesn't give us a very happy story with respect to protecting the things that we may wish to protect, particularly in a future where neuroscience becomes more possible. So we're going to focus on this as the descriptive model and then see how that works with emerging neuroscience. So this existing approach of treating evidence as physical and unprivileged or testimonial and privileged subject to an excuse-based model has left a lot of murkiness in existing doctrine. So even before we get to the murkiness that the future neuroscientific techniques will introduce, I want to show you what some of the problems are with the excuse-based model and how it leaves existing problems. So in United States v. Estelle, the court held that when a defendant is compelled to undergo a psychiatric evaluation and that psychiatrist then testified at the sentencing hearing that he thought the defendant was a future danger to society, his testimony was based on testimonial aspects of the defendant's evaluation. So the psychiatrist asked the defendant to recount the crime. And based on the way that the defendant recounted the crime, the psychiatrist said, I think this person poses a future danger to society. They seem to demonstrate some aspects of a sociopathic personality. Therefore, I think this person would likely pose a future danger. The court said, you can't testify with respect to that even at the sentencing hearing because when the person was compelled to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, they were forced to testify against themselves. But then the court dropped a footnote. And in the footnote, the court said, so the defendant could have potentially been evaluated based on the facial mannerisms, the tics that he displayed as he was responding to questions. Those little facial tics might not actually be protected under the right against self-incrimination because those might just be physical evidence. He said that the science isn't there yet today, so we're not really going to opine on that issue, but we just drop a footnote to say that's an interesting problem that we have no answer to, right? And it turns out that's a problem today because the biometric identity information and the biometric scanning information is something that we could actually use and that people are using to provide interesting types of predictions about behavior. So likewise, in Schmerber v. California, the case I mentioned about taking a blood sample from individuals, from the individual to figure out whether or not he was intoxicated, the court posited in dicta that lie detection tests, which measure physical changes in the bodies, make inferences about a person's responses, is quasi-testimonial evidence. But the court nevertheless said they weren't going to resolve this issue, and they didn't know whether quasi-testimonial evidence actually would violate the right against self-incrimination or if it would not. And the excuse-based model actually might predict that neither of these do, because it doesn't put the defendant in the hard position of choice. There is no choice involved at all if it's simply reading your physical reactions, which you have very little control over. And so if we take the excuse-based model to be a true descriptive model of what's happening, then even though the court says these present tricky problems, they may not actually present such tricky problems if the court would simply resolve them based on the way that they've resolved other physical evidence. And while it's clear that the privilege against self-incrimination applies to the production of business records, as I mentioned, that act of production says, yes, I have the documents, yes, they are in my possession, yes, I recognize that these papers are responsive to the request that you submitted for papers, that act itself might be testimonial. The underlying records themselves are not. So the actual business record itself is unprotected. And yet there is a circuit split right now that exists about whether or not personal papers, like your personal diary that you have created and your personal letters that you have written, are unprivileged and unprotected by the right against self-incrimination, or privileged and protected against the right of self-incrimination. Now, you would think the answer would be the same between these two. Business records versus personal papers, they should be exactly the same. And yet the circuits who are on the side of saying maybe there's some exception that protects this, say that there's a heartbreaking exception. When it would break the heart of the Fifth Amendment to admit this type of evidence, then it must protect it. What does that mean? Right? How do we figure out when it's going to break the heart of the Fifth Amendment in order to protect evidence, and how do we figure out when it isn't? And the excuse-based model, again, would predict this isn't protected, right? Because there's no hard choice that you're presented with. When you wrote it, you weren't writing it in response to any government compulsion at all. You were writing it just as your own personal diary. The act of production, again, might be protected, but what if you don't need to produce it? What if it could be obtained without your act of production, and the government could simply obtain that information without you? One case in the Second Circuit illustrates well the difficulty that courts are facing in trying to determine whether evidence is physical versus testimonial. Now, I made this tattoo. It doesn't really look like this, I hope. But the court in United States v. Greer, a case decided last year, describes a case in which investigators arrested a suspect after finding drug contraband in a rental car. And the rental car was not in his name, but was in the name of Tangela Hudson. And yet, and he thinks he didn't know a Tangela. He'd never heard of a Tangela. And an investigator said, that can't be true, because I saw a tattoo on his arm that said Tangela. And it was in a big heart. And so chances are he knows who Tangela is. So the defendant challenged the use of the tattoo against him. He said, no, using the tattoo against me violates my privilege against self-incrimination. And you would think, well, that's physical evidence, right? That's easy. The court isn't going to protect that. But the court struggled mightily over this issue because it was a written word. And so they're like, well, is that testimonial? Because it's a word, right? And if it had been just a physical tattoo, they wouldn't have struggled so mightily. So what they ultimately decided was, this is testimonial evidence. It's testimonial because it's a word. And he was trying to communicate something, which is his love of Tangela, by having the tattoo on his arm. But because the police spotted it without forcing him to bare his arm, it wasn't compelled. So therefore, it didn't violate the right against self-incrimination. Well, right result, maybe. Wrong process, for sure. Right? Because according to all of the court's prior cases, tattoos are physical evidence. The question of compulsion is, you can be compelled to actually show anything that is physical evidence because it's not forcing you to be a witness against yourself. So this case is decided wrongly. Maybe it gets at something we want to protect, but it's decided wrongly, and it's because courts are having such a hard time trying to figure out what is this difference between physical versus testimonial evidence. And this brings me to the taxonomy that I propose. So I propose that it makes little to any sense to have a testimonial versus physical dichotomy. For those of you philosophy majors, you recognize that this is just embracing a kind of dualistic idea of mind and body. It's something that you could try to convince people until you turn blue in the face that the mind-body distinction isn't something that's tenable within an area of self-incrimination, but that doesn't work. So what I propose is, and I'm going to show you how I get to this taxonomy, I propose that all evidence is in some sense physical, right? So rather than focusing on the form that evidence takes, the test should be on the nature of the evidence itself. We should classify evidence based on what the evidence is it identifying, automatic, memorialized, or uttered? And I'm going to propose that some of these categories implicate the privilege against self-incrimination while others do not. And neuroscience uniquely enables us to construct this taxonomy and then to use it to predict and understand where we might wish to draw the line and to ask the hard normative questions of what do we want the privilege against self-incrimination to protect. So to illustrate this taxonomy, I have a little hypothetical that I play out in the paper, and it helps us kind of think about it. So this is what I imagined as a kind of futuristic hypothetical. And remember, the science that I'm going to talk about here is using as a thought experiment. Much of it may never materialize. We may never get to the point where we can do the things that I'm proposing we could do with the science, but it helps us think about the ethical issues that arise. So a woman is murdered in her home, and the crime is captured on a home security video. The recording reveals the woman struggling with an unidentifiable masked man holding a hammer. In the ensuing struggle, the woman delivers a dizzying blow to the back of his head. A second masked man enters the room. He says, "Let's go" to first. The second man uses the hammer to fatally wound the woman. And the video ends there with the two men dragging the woman out of the home. When the police arrive at the crime scene the next day, they find no trace of the crime, save the videotape and the hammer. And the police correctly suspect that the woman's husband is one of the perpetrators. 2 weeks later, they bring him in for questioning. All right, so what could we imagine would be evidence that they might be able to use from neuroscience to try to determine whether or not the husband is in fact the perpetrator? So the first category that I proposed was identifying information. And I present identifying information here as a structural brain image, which could be visualized through static brain imaging, such as a CT scan. And if the husband suffered a blow to his head, we might be able to see that blow through neuroimaging. Identifying information are things like a person's name, their birth date, their weight, their height, their clothing, their shoe size, their blood type, potentially even identifying DNA. And to date, the courts that have addressed information falling within this category have uniformly agreed that identifying information is outside the scope of self-incrimination. And this is consistent with an excuse-based model of privilege because an individual faces no hard choice when they're forced to bear their identifying information. In fact, they face no choice at all. So you might think this would be perfectly fine. They could use neuroscience in order to look and see whether or not he suffered a blow to his head. And there we go. The second category is automatic information. So if the husband is brought in 2 weeks later, right, which is what I said, he's not brought in the next day, his primary brain injury most likely will have resolved, which means we might not be able to visualize his primary brain injury through structural CT scanning. But nevertheless, a secondary brain injury will remain. And secondary brain injuries are apparent through things like functional neuroimaging, right? So we could look at the blood flow to the region of the brain that's impacted by the trauma. And a person who suffered even a minor head injury will have decreased blood flow to the region of the brain in which he suffered a head injury. So we might be able to use functional neuroimaging in order to detect whether or not he actually suffered a blow to his head. This type of functioning is automatic, meaning that individual exercises little to no control over this type of information. So automatic evidence means those things like your actions and reactions that involve no conscious control by the individual. This category has yet to be recognized as a distinct category by any court. And yet, in an information age, much of the information that investigators collect is actually automatically generated information. Now, I thought I was going to have a slide about that. But United States v. Jones is a case that was just decided by the United States Supreme Court a couple of months ago. And in that case, the court had to deal with the question of whether or not using GPS triangulation of an individual's movements violated their right against search and seizure, okay, under the Fourth Amendment. And the government said no search had occurred. because a person was simply traveling through physical streets. Okay, so it was simply traveling through physical streets. They were voluntarily exposing their movements to the public, and so if they used GPS to detect those voluntary movements, then it was no Fourth Amendment search. The court disagreed. They said there was a search, but the reason they said there was a search was a very narrow reason, which is that the GPS was physically attached to the person's car, therefore trespassing upon their property and intruding upon a property right. The only interest that the court recognized was physical intrusion upon a person's space, not privacy of their movements. They left for a future case whether or not a person's privacy of their movements might be protected, but right now the only thing that's protected is attaching it. Now, of course, most of you recognize that you have GPS technology probably in your cell phones, which the government has not put in there, or many of you have GPS that's automatically installed in your cars, or you have OnStar in your cars, which means no physical trespass is required in order to have tracking of your movements. And this category, automatically generated information, right, which is your triangulation of your movements, or the routing information that's on the top of your email addresses, or the numbers that are sent to your cell phone carrier, all of the information about your computer system that you're using, all of that's simply automatically generated information. It involves no conscious control of the individual. This is a category we have to recognize as a distinct category and start to figure out, does the right against self-incrimination apply here? Chances are not, if we're going to have the excuse-based model be the model that defines whether or not you have a right against self-incrimination. And it seems like the Fourth Amendment isn't going to protect it, so what will, if anything? This entire category of information about ourselves and our identities may be something that's up for grabs. The third, oh, there's more. All right, so just to give you a couple of ideas about things that we could do with neuroimaging, automatic information involves not just your automatic functioning in your brain. It doesn't just show blood flow, but it might also show things like your deep inward feelings. So this is a study about pathological gamblers where they're shown gambling-related images, and functional magnetic resonance imaging shows the brains of the gamblers have less activity in regions involved in impulse control. So we might want to know, how does he feel about his wife, right? And if we're interested in knowing, how does he feel about his wife? Does he hate her? Does he love her? Do we want to know what his deep inward feelings are? Maybe automatically generated information could tell us that, and maybe he has no right against self-incrimination that would protect him. Likewise, we might want to know, is he likely to pose a future danger in society? And there have been a lot of functional neuroimaging studies that have been done to try to predict future dangerousness. Predictions of future dangerousness are notoriously terrible. These are not much better, but they're starting to actually gain some traction and some acceptance. And one example is a study about pedophilia, showing that there is reduced activation in the hypothalamus and lateral prefrontal cortex during visual erotic stimulation with images. Could we use those types of images to evoke an automatic response and then use that information to predict future dangerousness and use that in sentencing? Would that violate a person's right against self-incrimination? Well, if we think about Estelle v. Smith, where the court said that mannerisms might be permissible even if the testimony that was given during the psychiatric evaluation is not, then we predict this would be fine. So, let's skip here, which is the third category. This is memorialized information. So I mentioned to you that there is the business papers and the diaries, and right now there's a conflict with respect to the heartbreak exception. Well, the next category I proposed was memorialized information. And memorialized evidence includes recorded papers and effects, such as written documents, depictions, photographs, stored electronic records, or even encoded memories in the brain. And this area, more than any, has given the courts the most difficulty in resolving. So to illustrate this category, consider the following experiment. Faces and speakers leave unique neural fingerprints on the brain. So if the husband were to have heard the other suspect speak the words, "let's go," then there would be a neural fingerprint that neuroimaging could detect by playing the sounds of the video gathered from the crime scene. The excuse-based model of privilege would predict that such evidence is unprivileged because the memory was created without compulsion. And so only the act of production would be protected, but if there was a way to activate implicit memory without actually forcing a person through the act of production, there'd be no hard choice the person faced. So this evidence would be protected, would be unprotected under the excuse-based model of privilege. Neuroscience even allows us to distinguish between specific episodic memories. In this study, there was neuroimaging that was done of a woman walking past a trash can throwing away a coffee cup. And the researchers tried to detect which of 3 episodic memories a person was recalling, having shown them all 3 images. And with pretty high degree of accuracy, they were able to distinguish between which of 3 episodic memories a person was actually imagining. So you can imagine that trying to detect specific episodic memories of the brain would be possible. We may be able to retrieve that kind of information, and again, the excuse-based model of privilege would suggest that such evidence would be unprotected. The final category I propose is utterances. And utterances are thoughts, visual images, words or statements that are verbalized or recalled to the conscious mind. And this category of evidence is the primary focus of Fifth Amendment protections. If the government seeks the silent utterances of the husband, for example, they may be able to detect his words, visual imagery, or his present conscious thoughts that he's experiencing. And I propose that even though under current models such evidence would be considered physical and therefore unprotected, that the right way to think about them is utterances. Whether spoken aloud or silently ruminated, their utterance is just the same. This could range from a simple yes-no response. So neuroscience promises a much more precise type of lie detection, right? So the claim is by companies like Cephos or No Lie MRI, which is a terrible name for a company, I think, that it requires more cognitive load to lie than it does to tell the truth. And so there is greater activation in the brain when you are trying to lie than when you tell the truth. And so the claim is, from companies like this, that with 97% accuracy, they can detect whether or not you're telling a truth or a lie. So they could ask the husband a series of questions. And in Schmerber v. California, where the court left unresolved whether traditional lie detection, which is inferences based on physical evidence, would be quasi-testimonial, these would be utterances, simple utterances, yes and no, simply through your bodily responses or your brain. So this resolves that quasi-testimonial category of Schmerber by California, telling us that such utterances, whether occurring silently or aloud, are utterances to which the privilege against self-incrimination would apply. And neuroscience shows us the breadth and depth of this category. We think and express ourselves not just through words, but also through complex imagery. We visualize thoughts far more than thinking in complete sentences, and neuroscience now enables us to see that complex imagery in the mind. This depicts one such study where the computer algorithms are predicting the images that a person is seeing. More recent work by Jack Gallen's lab in UC Berkeley is fascinating, where they show the subjects a series of video clips and then use pattern recognition technology to try to show the moving images that a person is seeing. And even though they only go through several layers of the visual cortex to do so, not through all of the detailed layers of the visual cortex, the images that they recreate are stunningly accurate, and they're images that the computer has never seen. It's simply predicting based on past blood flow patterns and associations what it actually looks like. So this helps us understand the visual imagery, whether through drawing a crime scene, depicting the murder weapon, imagining the hammer. All of these things would be utterances which the privilege against self-incrimination would apply. Whether they're visual images or words in the brain, it is the type of testimonial evidence that the privilege should apply to. This is the easiest category, the one that mirrors the spoken word, right? Imagined thoughts. So each and every category that I've described up until now, including this one, which is researchers being able to decode actual words and thoughts in the brain rather than just the visual imagery of the brain, these are merely blood flow patterns, right? It's just detecting blood flow through the brain. And Schmerber v. California would say, blood isn't protected, right? Whatever you do with it, whether it's to determine whether a person is intoxicated or what the ideas are that they're thinking, it's just physical evidence to which the privilege against self-incrimination wouldn't apply. But this new taxonomy I propose here helps us to understand that it's not the form that the evidence takes that matters to us. What matters is the nature of the evidence itself. Is it identifying, automatic, memorialized, or uttered? So this gives us a satisfying descriptive answer for how classic and new cases will be resolved. And you can see that I've aligned some of the classic cases like lineups, physiological functioning, business papers, spoken responses along the spectrum. It allows us to have a better descriptive understanding of where present cases would fall. It also allows us to predict new cases like structural imaging or functional imaging or passive recognition or passive memory retrieval and silent responses. But while this gives us a really good descriptive understanding of the Fifth Amendment, does it answer for us where we would draw the line normatively? So many may find that the ability to use memories against an individual strikes at the core of what they think the privilege against self-incrimination should protect. Maybe this is the very heartbreak exception that those circuits are talking about, is if you could use a person's memories to incriminate them, does that break the heart of what the Fifth Amendment is? Others believe that automatic evidence should be protected, right? The idea that your GPS triangulation could be used against you and that isn't self-incrimination. Or the automatic functioning of your brain could be used against you and that isn't self-incrimination. Some believe that gets to the sphere of mental privacy that would matter. So where you draw the line on this spectrum is going to depend on what values you think the Fifth Amendment should protect. And I propose that this taxonomy helps us do that better. Right? Physical versus testimonial doesn't help us figure out normatively where we should draw the line. This taxonomy helps us think about what's the value we're seeking to protect by the self-incrimination clause. And it gives us a better way to understand exactly what's at stake in these debates. We can see which types of evidence are protected, which are not, and then begin to decide what should the privilege against self-incrimination protect. So this paper is complete, as I mentioned. It was published in the Stanford Law Review in February, but it's part of a larger body of work that I'm working on. So I mentioned the Fourth Amendment. I have another article that's coming out in April called Searching Secrets, which deals with some of the Fourth Amendment's implications of the work that I've talked about. And I'm working on a larger project called On Cognitive Liberty. And On Cognitive Liberty seeks to say, look, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, Confrontation Clause, the First Amendment, freedom of speech and association, none of these actually get at protecting this broader idea of mental privacy or this broader idea of cognitive liberty. And if we think about the kind of assaults that might be coming to our cognitive liberty, from neuromarketing techniques to investigative techniques to enabling techniques like things like cognitive enhancement or memory dampening, all of these require us to think carefully about what is our model going to be of cognitive liberty? What should be included within it? How do we balance it against societal interests? I look forward to your comments and questions.
That was great. The floor is open.
So I was curious, are we bound to the excuse-based model based on case law, or is that just like a scholarly thing?
So, go ahead.
Yeah, and based on that, I guess the one part of your framework that, I mean, I definitely agree that this is a much more coherent way to look at it, but I was interested in what you thought about the kind of automatic, like memory retrieval. I think you call it passive memory retrieval. Something about that kind of makes me think it should be respected under that personal space kind of justification, where it's like, this is the type of thing I should be able to take to the grave with me,
right,
and no one should have access to that. So I thought that, I guess my question is, are we bound to the excuse-based model, and how would we deal with that under that justification?
So I don't think we're bound to the excuse-based model. I think it describes well current doctrine to the extent that you believe in stare decisis, right, which is that past precedent actually binds future cases, and we're somewhat bound only in past precedents, right? But I think what I'm trying to do in this paper is to show we're committed to something that may not actually align with what we're seeking to protect, right? And the way that we can visualize that is by understanding, first, what are the categories of evidence that we're really dealing with here, and how would we predict it would resolve with respect to future cases. And I think passive memory retrieval is one of the great examples of it, right? Which is, if we could access your memories through things like masking techniques or attentional distraction techniques, right? And we could actually find information out from your brain directly, and the excuse-based model says that isn't protected, my intuition is I want to go to the grave with that stuff, right? I mean, my personality and my identity in large part defines in part about what I'm willing to share, right? And my ability to form intimate relationships with other people, you know, depends on that as well. That I share some things with some people and not other things with other people, and that helps me form, you know, associations and relationships that differ between individuals. And so my personality, my identity, my associations, my relationships all turn in part on my ability to actually shape what I share with whom. And so I think, you know, this is really seeking to put pressure on that and say, look, the model tells us that isn't going to be protected. How comfortable with that are you? And that's where On Cognitive Liberty came from, because, you know, as I think about it, we're not bound by it. Is it likely to change very much? Probably not that much, right? And if the predictions that I make are right, which is that we're going to end up treating a lot of this like physical evidence or just have an incoherent doctrine, maybe we need to step back and say, how do we think about this as a robust and coherent framework? How do we think about what is it that we're interested in protecting, and how are we going to protect it, and how are we going to recognize and protect it?
So could you put the slide for this one?
Sure.
Just so we can remember the thing.
Sure. Yes?
I just wanted to go back to one of your first slides that had on one hand DNA leftover
Mhm.
and then on the other the sort of leftover ECG or
Yeah.
implied that. I'm wondering, yeah, I'm wondering where some of this falls in terms of, right, I could leave my DNA here,
Yeah.
but you have to put me into an fMRI to get the blue-red
Right.
right up on there. So does that, you've been saying that there's sort of an action required in delivery. It seems like that has to be active. You have to compel me into the machine to get the,
Right.
so it's not really left behind in the same way.
Well, okay, so two answers to your question.
Yeah.
First, imagine this, which is, there's a company called WeCU Technologies, it's funny, WECU. And they're an Israeli-based company who claim that they can integrate into the kiosk of an airport, like the e-check-in,
Yeah.
a little thermal imaging video, that you're unaware of, and then they can use masking techniques where as you're going from screen to screen, like 0 bags, I want that seat, they can flash up images, either through attentional distraction or through masking, and then they can read your changes in your face, right? And then they claim also that if they could have just like you in one of those machines, like, the sandwiches that you walk through in the airport for x-rays, they claim that that could be a capacitor, right, which would enable them to pick up EEG, right, which means you're leaving it behind, right? You're not actually putting you in a scanner, they're just traces they're picking up. So in this world of kind of remote detection, you can pick that up and it'll be just like this. Now, the question of compulsion is, it only applies if you are being forced to be a witness against yourself, right? So I can force you to sit for a blood test without violating your right against self-incrimination, and it's not compulsion to be a witness, it has to be both. Right, so if I can compel you to give physical evidence. What it implicates is your Fourth Amendment right against search and seizure, which is, it has to be a minimally intrusive technique.
Right.
But intrusion is based on the physical intrusion into your
So
body.
putting me into a tube isn't really.
No, it's not, right? I mean, it's not surgery, it's not, like, you're just lying there passively when I'm taking information from you. And so you wouldn't think it would either violate the right against self-incrimination or violate your right against search and seizure, which leaves you in this quandary of like, that seems wrong.
Right, so it doesn't have to be left behind in this way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
I wonder if we could complicate the scientific part of the story a bit more, because all of the technologies we're talking about, like fMRI, any of the brain scans, the older ones, PET, and all these, they're mediated by humans. Somebody has to read them, and they're subject to argument. They're subject to interpretation, both in production and in the interpretation of the results. Right?
Yeah.
And so, how does that play into it? I mean, where in the hypothetical, I understand you're treating it as if fMRI shows sort of something one can't argue with, but in the real world, it seems to me you never end up at that point where.
Yeah, that's true of all evidence, right? I mean, so any evidence that you provide, whether it's testimony and I'm trying to figure out your credibility, or blood evidence that you've left behind that somebody has to interpret, to DNA matches that somebody has to interpret, they're all based on subjective interpretation. What that goes to is the credibility of the information, right? Or the admissibility of the information, depending on the extent to which you actually think it's scientifically reliable. That doesn't get at your constitutional guarantees, right? So what it says is a person has to interpret the results. It is subject to interpretation. A person could therefore cross-examine and challenge the veracity of that evidence, but that doesn't change whether or not, or that doesn't implicate whether or not it violates your right against self-incrimination or search and seizure, unless I'm missing your question.
I don't think you're misunderstanding. I just think that when you get into the cognitive sciences, when you get into fMRI, where there's a lot of there's a tendency to believe it immediately because it is visual, and we identify with brains. That sort of the extreme subjectivity and production of that science compared to many other things.
Yeah, well, so let me just make sure I clarify, which is, I'm using this as a thought experiment, right? I'm not trying to say that I think the science actually shows, right, that his brain was damaged there, nor do I necessarily believe that the police will ever use this type of technology or that it will ever develop to the point where we can pick up remotely your brain waves or that we could in fact read your memories out. But that people are making claims that I'm drawing from actual scientific studies to create this taxonomy gives it an ability to actually say, like, look, this is theoretically possible, right? So if we're going to deal with this question, it both helps us understand it, but it gives us a thought experiment that is much more grounded and much more real, therefore forcing people to grapple with it now rather than saying, oh, that's a futuristic technology that we would never have to worry about, right? Because the level of scientific admissibility is pretty low for a lot of the stuff. All you need is kind of peer review and acceptance, which much of this has already reached that level. Other questions? Yes?
So I think there's a fundamental premise that took you down this path. And the fundamental premise actually had to do with the legal interpretation of compulsion, because that's what forced the physical versus testimonial distinction. And then you then tried to tackle the physical versus testimonial distinction, where you could have tackled the compulsion distinction, right? And for me, I don't know the first thing about the law, right? But for me, the compulsion distinction is actually the more interesting one, and the relation between compulsion and publicly observable versus private information.
Yeah.
You would still actually come to some of your conclusions, but they'd be framed somewhat differently.
So that's actually where I started, was compulsion. But the problem with starting there is it's largely ignored in the cases, and the reason it's largely ignored in the cases is because you can compel a person to do just about anything if it doesn't force you to be a witness, right? And so to be a witness is defined by the physical versus testimonial divide, which
But
means...
I'm saying that's the problem.
No, I agree with you. It's just what I was trying to do was say, okay, look, the idea of compulsion and what it means has largely been dealt with under the Fourth Amendment rather than the Fifth Amendment. And so that's what the Searching Secrets article deals with, is trying to recharacterize what the nature of the intrusion is that we're talking about, because the nature of intrusion that has been discussed in prior cases has largely been based on physical violence. And so I just, recognizing where the doctrine is aligned, I dealt with that issue in the Fourth Amendment to say, really, when we're talking about intrusion is about more than just intrusion upon your physical space. It's about intrusion into your secrets, right? And the idea of intrusion into your secrets is just as intrusive, even though we haven't traditionally done as good of a job measuring that intrusion, right? It's much harder, for example, to measure an offense to your reputation than burning down your house. And measuring the damages to offending your reputation or to breaking into your email account is much harder to put a number around. But nevertheless, many of us would feel more violated by hacking into our email accounts or our computers or our cloud servers than we would physically intruding into most of our space. And so, given that that's where it's aligned, I ended up dealing with that issue in the Fourth Amendment, but it's awkward, right? I mean, we should be able to deal with it here. And it's just the way that, it all aligns, which is what finally led me to say, okay, look, I'm going to deal with these doctrinally, and I'm going to deal with this bigger project on cognitive liberty to say this is all nonsensical, right? It's not actually getting at the things we really care about. We need a new model to get at the things we really care about. Other questions? Yes.
Can I have this?
Yes, now you can have that slide back, yes.
And this is the sum up.
Yeah.
And this is maybe a bigger picture question, Nita, but I was struck by the title that you've given to your big project, which
Yeah.
is cognitive liberty,
Yeah.
and the focus here on privacy.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to guess where you're going in terms of the distinctions you need to draw or not,
Yeah.
and whether your project is really more about privacy or liberty with relation to God.
Yeah.
And then connected to that, if we just stay with the mill analogy for a little bit, on the liberty part, obviously the constraint would depend on the justification.
Yeah.
Right, and the purpose. So this project is all about self-incrimination. In your larger project, you'll go
Yeah.
beyond self.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about
So
privacy and liberty?
So I'm glad to pick up the riff, right, on Hill. But the idea of that one, so I break it down into three parts. I break it down into things you can do to yourself, like cognitive enhancement, taking propranolol to prevent the consolidation of fear memories. Things that commercial actors may do, like neural advertising, things that are trying to manipulate your, behavioral choices. And then things that the government might do, which would include things like detection or manipulation or coercion of your cognitive state. And thinking about under each of those different models, is there a liberty interest which would guard against, and not just privacy, but a broader liberty interest, right, which would have to be involved in your right to self-determination and your right to freedom of association and right to freedom of thought, which would enable you to do things like prevent the consolidation of fear memories. And you could imagine a rape victim who goes in to the hospital and wishes to actually have her Panadol to prevent the consolidation of fear memories so that she doesn't develop PTSD after a rape. That seems great, and yet it also means that she's not available to testify against the perpetrator. And what does that mean? How do we balance those interests? Does she have a right to actually have those things? What if it's experimental? Does she have any interest in it? So it's kind of a broader project to think about, how do we think about right to self-determination and right to freedom of association and kind of these broader interests, which includes privacy, when it relates to issues that impact society and yourself. I think there was a question over there. All right, we may be out of time, but yeah.
I think we are out of time,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Well, join me again in thanking